Back when we were in college, we actually came through on a tour, two different tours in the 70s. And it was a mining town. They mined nickel there. And they had smelters and everything. And so when you drove through Sudbury, it looked like the moon. There was just gray and slag heaps all over the place. It was just, and it smelled bad and everything else. I believe it was 2001, I was invited to do to conduct a wedding, and it was in the town of Sudbury. I didn't recognize it. If you had told me I was in Sudbury, I wouldn't have believed you. But it had, everything had been replanted. The forestation had taken over. It was green. It was plush trees. It was gorgeous, almost park-like, and so it was this juxtaposition in my mind, of this, this gray, dirty picture of a place back when, and seeing it transformed just in 30 years or more, and it was absolutely spectacular.
What time is it? Gosh, I rarely keep track of the time, so I don't know. I'm sorry.
2022. Well,
they talk about. It's interesting. I've heard over the years that talk about the golden years. 1,
2, 3.
We've come through different phases. We have grandchildren now, and that's absolutely delightful. I love my grandchildren. We have a wonderful time together, but at the same time, I feel like I have come to a place in my ministry where I am very comfortable with my own role, my place, comfortable in my own skin. I feel like I've reached a place where I have a sense of well-being, a sense of authority.
Well, in my mind, it's really time to, submit our desires to halt time. The elves wanted to freeze time so that, the tides of the world would not sweep away the things that they loved. But honestly, we need to submit that to the Lord and give that up and allow God's time to be our time. And so for me, it's really a matter of being okay with the time that, being okay with the fact that time is passing.
It's the time before Jesus returns.
Good answer. Good priestly answer.
Exactly.
Well, it's 8 o'clock, but it's what time of my life is it? I suppose I'm hoping it's a fruitful time of my life. It's changing a bit. My children are leaving home.
It's that season in life where I have less patience for things that aren't central to what I think are really important. The calling on my life, the relationships in my life. I so want to be engaged in those things with those people with a sense of urgency I don't think I had even a few years ago.
Well, friends, welcome, and welcome if you're joining us in the building. Welcome if you're joining us from elsewhere. This is the third of our Lent with the Inklings sessions, the course that we've been running over the last few weeks, taking us through Lent. This is the third of four, in fact, sessions we're running. And this evening we're thinking a little bit about the Inklings and their view of time, and then thinking a little bit about how that coheres with the Bible's view of time. If we've not met, my name is Paul. I'm on the staff team here. But I'm going to hand you over pretty much straight away to Julia and to Simon, who have done the majority of work putting these evenings together, both in their way. Have done a lot of thinking about the Inklings. Simon holds C.S. Lewis's old position at Magdalen in medieval English, and Julia runs the sort of Oxford Centre for Fantasy Writing, something along those lines, which is dedicated to Tolkien and to his writings and the writing of the Tolkien Inklings more generally. So without further ado, let me hand over to Julia, I think.
Good evening, everybody. The title of this is I'm Late, I'm Late. So if people do come in late, they've obviously taken that to heart. But you'll probably recognize that this comes not from the Inklings, but from, shall I move to this? Okay, there we are. My Kylie mic isn't working. So the title is obviously taken not from the Inklings, but from their predecessor, the Oxford-based mathematician Lewis Carroll, with his famously in a hurry White Rabbit. Now, we all know that if we are early, on time, or late, we know there are 60 seconds in an hour and 24 hours in a day. But what exactly is time? I don't know about you, but I found the last 2 years have played with my perception of time. So we're actually going to start thinking and reflecting on the last couple of years and the pandemic. So in your groups, I want you to have a little think about how has the pandemic changed your attitude to time, if at all. So it's like a warm-up question. So if you take a few minutes just to discuss the pandemic and time. Just checking my mic is working. Good.
I just thought it might not be relevant.
So when the history books get written, I wonder if this is one of those things that is going to come up in the world reaction to the pandemic. And we thought it was really worth spending some time pushing the pause button on this Lent course so that we can begin to think about it. Obviously, we're not through the pandemic by any means, but it does feel as though we are coming out the other side in our attitude to it. So it was a question that I asked to various members of the church and to our experts, and we've got a little video montage of them answering that. But I want to play this to you in particular because when I asked this question to Malcolm Guite, the wonderful Malcolm Guite, he suddenly pulled this poetry book off his shelf and said, "Oh, by the way, here's a poem I've written on this very topic." So look out for the treat at the end when we pause and enjoy a poem on this very theme. So roll the tape.
Has the pandemic changed your view of time?
No.
Yes, it has. Yes, it definitely has changed my view of time.
Has the pandemic changed my attitude to time? I would say no, because I'm a writer, so my life hasn't changed very much. I spend a lot of time on my own at my desk, and it didn't make me feel it's more valuable, less valuable, there's more or less of it, so no.
I think it must have. I sort of have almost got used to life as it is, and that seems like a previous age almost.
So I think the thing that's strange about time for me, and perhaps the pandemic has simply changed my view or increased my awareness of the fact that time is a mystery.
Yeah, I probably think about what I do a bit more.
Well, I think like everyone else, all the restrictions and everything else, the lockdowns and all of that, it forced me to slow down. It was interesting. I realized I went to put my wristwatch on a couple months ago, and the battery had died. And I didn't even know it because I hadn't worn my watch for well over a year because I didn't need to.
Well, I think it's made me lazy. And I think somehow things seem to take longer now than they used to, because I think I've got kind of slow because we didn't have to rush about so much.
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting one. I think it's in some ways, certainly the very first lockdown, I felt a great restoration of time. I felt, because I no longer had the commute and because the skies were, I had the sense of the fullness of time. That's one of my favorite biblical phrases, that in the fullness of time he came. I just thought it might not be relevant, but when I wrote my quarantine quatrains, which we did as a thing for the care workers, and Roger Wagner made very beautiful illustrations too, I started with this sense of a rush being taken away and a kind of the bowl filled. I'll just throw it in for fun. It's my response to the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, so it's written in the same. It's a sort of COVID, lockdown Rubaiyat. So I begin with the same word, awake. You may remember that poem begins, awake the morning in the bowl of night, flung the stone that puts the stars to flight. Awake to what was once a busy day, when you would rush and hurry on your way, snatch at your breakfast, start the grim commute. But time and tide have turned another way. For now, like you, the day is yawning wide, and all its old events are set aside. It opens gently for you, takes its time, and holds for you whatever you decide. This morning's light is brighter than it seems. Your room is raftered with its golden beams. The bowl of night has richly filled with sleep, and dawn's left hand is holding you all your dreams. Your mantle clock still sounds its silver chime. The empty page invites an idle rhyme. This quarantine has taken many things, but left you with the precious gift of time.
So I couldn't resist sharing that with you. I thought it was so lovely. So we've got more questions for you this week than we did with the previous week. So we're straight on to the next one. It's a small subject. We want you to decide in the next 5 minutes, what is time and how do we perceive it differently at different stages of our life? So what is it and how do we perceive it differently at different stages of our life? Right, over to you to solve this mystery. So obviously you will all have solved that problem in those few minutes. But the point of asking that was to bring to mind that it's actually our perspective on time that decides our relationship with it. So for example, I expect many of you might have said, when I was a child at primary school, a week used to feel as though it lasted forever. I can certainly remember my primary school weeks were marked by the spelling test on Friday, and I was convinced it was just like what now feels like a year away on Monday, because you're living with a different perspective, whereas now a week goes by like that. And we've all just passed through 2 years where our perception of passing time has been challenged when the usual markers have been taken away and new ones put in their place. I think it's helpful to reflect on this experience going forward because it is going to be part of this century's history. The Inklings were also intrigued by time and how it could be understood in new ways. Tolkien wrote his stories of Middle-earth in part to provide a satisfying history, a backstory for Europe, reimagining it. As part of that, he invented races of people, such as the elves and the Ents, and standalones like Tom Bombadil, who are almost immortal. That gave him an intriguing challenge to imagine time from the different perspectives of the long and the short-lived. So I'm just going to ask Joss to read us a small snippet from Fellowship of the Ring, when Legolas, who is the elf amongst the company, the Fellowship, talks about how he perceives the passing of time.
Nay, time does not tarry ever, he said. But change and growth is not in all things and places alike. For the elves, the world moves, and it moves both very swift and very slow. Swift because they themselves change little, and all else fleets by. It is a grief to them. Slow because they do not count the running years, not for themselves. The passing seasons are but ripples ever repeated in the long, long stream. Yet beneath the sun all things must wear to an end at last.
When you put alongside each other The Lord of the Rings and the Narnia Chronicles, you see Tolkien rewriting history and Lewis rerunning a version of biblical history from creation to Revelation in what is more or less a parallel world. Both are attempting to restore a sense of purpose to the unfolding ages. But time is tricky, slippery even. We can sometimes feel we've become adrift from our time, in good ways and bad.
So for my bit this evening, I want to look at a section from the Narnia Stories, and from the beginning of Prince Caspian. And you can probably remember the end of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, that moment when the children are grown up and they're now kings and queens of Narnia, and they're off out hunting the white stag, and they come across the lamppost in the field and suddenly realize that they remember their old lives and that they can recall having come through that wardrobe into Narnia for the first time and encountering that strange vision of a lamppost. And so they then go back through into the room and back to their old lives. But they find themselves children again. It's as if time hasn't passed at all. Lewis originally intended there to be just the one Narnian story, but soon found himself planning a sequel. And initially he wanted to write a prequel and to try and explain why there was a lamppost in Narnia. You sort of think he might know that because he put one there, but he wanted to try and create a story to explain that. But then he gave that up. He wrote a sort of an aborted first go at it, gave it up, and then decided to write a second Narnia story, and that was Prince Caspian, The Return to Narnia. And it opens with the four children again at the train station with their trunks all packed, ready to go back to boarding school at the beginning of the school term. But before the train pulls into the station, they suddenly find themselves being sucked out of the world to somewhere else. And Lewis says of that moment that he was thinking about what it would be like to be the genie in the lamp. You know, so when Aladdin shines the lamp, suddenly the genie has to suddenly appear. What would it be like to be the genie? And they find themselves in this strange place, nothing that they recognize, wandering around trying to get some kind of landmark to work out where they are. And they stumble on some old ruins that appear to attest to an earlier civilization, and that's where our reading begins.
This wasn't a garden,
said Susan presently.
it was a castle, and this must have been the courtyard.
I see what you mean,
said Peter.
Yes, that is the remains of a tower, and there is what used to be a flight of steps going up to the top of the walls. And look at those other steps, the broad, shallow ones going up to that doorway. It must have been the door into the Great Hall. Ages ago, by the look of it,
said Edmund.
Yes, ages ago,
said Peter.
I wish we could find out who the people were that lived in this castle and how long ago.
So there's a little gap here. Shortly after the last apple had been eaten, Susan went out to the well to get another drink. When she came back, she was carrying something in her hand.
Look,
she said in a rather choking kind of voice.
I found it by the well.
She handed it to Peter and sat down. The others thought she looked and sounded as if she might be going to cry. Edmund and Lucy eagerly bent forward to see what was in Peter's hand, a little bright thing that gleamed in the firelight.
Well, I'm jiggered,
said Peter, and his voice also sounded queer. Then he handed it to the others. All now saw what it was, a little chess knight, ordinary in size but extraordinarily heavy, because it was made of pure gold. And the eyes in the horse's head were two tiny little rubies, or rather one was, for the other had been knocked out.
Why?
said Lucy.
It's exactly like one of the golden chessmen we used to play with when we were kings and queens at Cair Paravel.
Cheer up, Sue,
said Peter to his other sister.
I can't help it. It brought back, such lovely times. And I remembered playing chess with fauns and good giants, and the mer people singing in the sea, and my beautiful horse, and...
Now,
said Peter in a quite different voice.
It's about time we four started using our brains. What about?
Asked Edmund.
Have none of you guessed where we are?
Said Peter.
Go on,
said Lucy.
I felt for hours that there was some wonderful mystery hanging over this place.
Fire ahead, Peter,
said Edmund.
We're all listening. We are in the ruins of Cair Paravel itself,
said Peter.
You know what we were puzzling about last night? That it was only a year ago since we left Narnia, but everything looks as if no one had lived in Cair Paravel for hundreds of years. Well, don't you see? You know that however long we seem to have lived in Narnia, when we got back through the wardrobe, it seemed to have taken no time at all.
Go on, said Susan. I think I'm beginning to understand.
And that means,
continued Edmund,
that once you're out of Narnia, you've no idea how Narnian time is going. Why shouldn't hundreds of years have gone past in Narnia while only 1 year has passed for us in England? By Jove, Ed,
said Peter.
I believe you've got it. In that sense, it really was hundreds of years ago that we lived in Cair Paravel, and now we're coming back to Narnia just as if we were Crusaders or Anglo-Saxons or ancient Britons or someone coming back to modern England.
So that's the end of our reading, and we wanted to give you just a few minutes to think about whether you've ever returned somewhere and not recognized it. So if you could just spend a minute or two in your groups just thinking about that. Okay, so I hope that sort of prompted some thought, but I just want to spend a few minutes just thinking about the Narnian idea of time, and it's very apparent in that particular passage, I think, how different the Narnian time is from our own. And in fact, after he completed the Narnia Stories, Lewis drew up an outline of the history of the world, in which he very precisely counted a total of 2,555 Narnian years from creation to the end of the world. And it's an interesting sort of map, because it shows us in a very graphic way that there's no equivalent between a Narnian year and an earthly one. So they run very differently. So we can see, for instance, that between the end of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the beginning of Prince Caspian, the extract we just looked at, so in human earthly time, that's in Narnian time, a very precise 1,303 years have elapsed. So it's very different. But then, if we move on, between 1941 and 1942, only 3 Narnian years have gone by. So there's no equivalent here at all. So what's the effect of this for Lewis? Well, one thing, of course, is that it allows him to telescope time in interesting ways. We can suddenly shoot forwards like we do in Prince Caspian, so that the palace that we see at the end of Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe has been derelict for hundreds of years when they get back, although they're only 1 year older. Or we can suddenly go back in time, and we can go to the creation of Narnia, we can go to the end times of Narnia. And in fact, all of that can be encompassed in the lives of just 2 of the people, 2 of the characters. So Diggory and Polly, who are the people in Magician's Nephew, which is the prequel as it finally got written. They're there at the beginning of it. They watched the creation of Narnia in The Magician's Nephew. And as an old man and as an old woman, they're present when Aslan recalls the stars and winds up Narnia in time for good. So just in their lifespan, they get to see the whole story of Narnia, from creation to the end. But unlike Diggory and Polly, who get to see the whole cosmic history of Narnia, the Pevensy children, that's the ones, Susan, Lucy, Edmund, and Peter, they're a bit more like us, because they're sort of living in the present, in the sense that their time frame doesn't give them access to the whole story. So, if you think how they must have felt at the end of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where they'd won the battle, they had, Aslan had returned, they defeated the White Witch, winter was turned back to spring. They go to the witch's palace, they turn all the statues from stone back to life, and everything's fine. They seem to have solved all of the Narnia problems, and they go back to their old lives. But just a year later, they find themselves back in Narnia, and in fact, what they discover now is that the country's being ruled by a tyrant king called Miraz, who has stolen the throne by killing his own brother, and now is determined to kill his nephew, Prince Caspian, the rightful heir to the throne, in order to allow his own son to become king. So they've now been summoned back into Narnia to help Caspian overthrow the usurping uncle and to free the talking animals, the fauns, the naiads, the dryads, all the rightful inhabitants of old Narnia, as it's called, who have been forced into hiding. So what we can see, I think, in the way that the children travel between our world and Narnia is that they get a sense of these bigger cycles of history of which they would otherwise be unaware. They're only seeing a little part of it otherwise in the individual stories, but because they are catapulting forward, they can see how much everything has changed. There's a nice bit in the last battle when the children arrive back in Narnia to find that Prince Rilian, who they have saved in the silver chair, is now, well, they hear a reference to King Rilian. They say, oh, of course he's a king now. And it turns out he's actually been dead 200 years. And they say, that's the problem with Narnia, is every time you come back, everyone that you knew has been dead for centuries. But this larger context, I think, offers an interesting perspective on the events of their own day. As I've mentioned, the books are set during the Second World War. If you remember at the beginning of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, they're evacuees being taken to the countryside. A conflict which, as Screwtape gleefully notes, humans have a very naive tendency of referring to as the war, as if it were to be the last of its kind. Lewis, of course, fought in the First World War, and so well understood the danger of assuming that any armistice and subsequent peace would be everlasting. So I think one of the things that the Pevensy children learn is that the war is a cyclical phenomenon. And by reminding us of this wider framework, I think Lewis is prompting us to consider our everyday lives in a larger eternal context. In an essay that Lewis wrote about the Second Coming, which was called The World's Last Night, that's a quote from a John Donne poem, Lewis likens the human life to a play. And he says we might think that our own actions have huge consequences for the play that we're in. But that's to assume that we know what the play is and which act we are currently in. But the reality is, of course, that we don't know what the play is, nor whether we're in Act 1 or Act 5. We don't know who the minor characters are and who the major ones are. Only the author does. And since we never see the play from the outside, only meet a tiny number of characters who happen to be on the stage at the same time as us, have no knowledge about the future, and only a partial and imperfect understanding of the past, all we can do is act as our conscience directs us in the moment. And he asks us to picture Act 3, Scene 7 of Shakespeare's play King Lear, which I'm sure you can all just conjure up immediately. But if you can't, let me just sort of remind you. You will remember it because it's that hideous moment in the play when the goodly, loyal, kind, elderly Gloucester has his eyes plucked out. Do you remember that bit? Out, vile jelly, where is thy lustre now? And he mentions this because here we have a number of major characters, Regan, Cornwall, and Edmund, who are all plotting, making plans for their own futures and for the future of the country. But he says there's another character on the stage who's so unimportant, he's only given the title First Servant. And he's under no great delusions about his importance. But at that moment, he witnesses a brutal act being committed, and he responds. He takes out his sword, he points it at his master, calls on him to stop, and is promptly stabbed by Regan and dies. That's his whole part right there. 8 lines in total. But, Lewis points out, if that were real life, it would be the best part to have played. So this importance of focusing on the present, I think, is one of the things that Lewis is trying to bring out in these different time frames. And he emphasizes this again in The Great Divorce. That was a work that was again read to the Inklings during the Second World War, where you've got those ghosts traveling to heaven on a day trip and being confronted with the eternal consequences of their choices. Everything at this moment boils down to now. They can choose to proceed on into the deeper heaven, or they can get back on the bus and go back to hell. And yet, almost all of them, the tyrannous boss, the possessive mother, the artist obsessed with his reputation, the apostate bishop, are unwilling to repent of their sin and accept the invitation. The one exception is a ghost whose lust appears as a lizard on his shoulder that an angel offers to kill for him. But even he's unsure and says, maybe I'll come back tomorrow. I'll just go and consult my doctor and check that this is the right treatment. And the angel says, there is no tomorrow. All days are present now. This moment contains all moments. Having witnessed these scenes, Lewis, who's the dreamer in this story, questions whether the decisions are actually significant, given that salvation has been predetermined. But his guide at this point, who's the writer George MacDonald, who's playing Virgil here to Lewis's Dante in this reworking of the Divine Comedy, he explains that it only seems this way to us because we experience our lives through the lens of time. It's only by looking through this lens, which is, he says, like looking through a telescope the wrong way and seeing our lives as a temporal succession of individual choices, that we're able to conceive of our own immortality and freedom to choose salvation. Otherwise, the enormity of the choice would be too great for us. And being eternal, God exists outside this temporal lens. It's a point that Lewis makes again nicely, I think, in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where Aslan appears for a time and he's with Lucy, he talks to her, and then he says, "I must go now, but I will see you again soon." And she says, "What do you call soon, Aslan?" And he says, "I call all times soon," and vanishes. Our propensity to worry about the future rather than focus on the present is well understood by Screwtape, who advises his nephew, Wormwood, to exploit this anxiety. So Screwtape explains that because humans live in time but are destined to eternity, the enemy, which is of course God, wants them to attend to both eternity and to the present, which is the point at which time touches eternity, since it's in that moment that humans are offered the freedom of choice. And so the future, by contrast, he says, is the most completely temporal part of time, the least like eternity. The future inflames hope and fear and prompts humans to waste their time dwelling on unrealities. And so Wormwood's job as a junior tempter is to stop his patient focusing on the present and committing the future to heaven, and instead make him perpetually pursue the rainbow's end. He says, never honest, nor kind, nor happy now.
So we've been talking about how time works as a perspective and seizing, in a way, seizing the moment. And we are living through a particular moment. Tolkien and Lewis also encourage us to think about how to make a meaningful and right use of time. You don't need me to point out the uncertainty we are facing, the pandemic, climate crisis, and then the sudden arrival of a terrible war in Europe, in Ukraine. And all of this can leave us feeling paralyzed with fear, unable to take those decisions for fear of the future. We, of course, can do actions like pray for the victims, pray for peace, but sometimes just the sheer weight of the problems feels overwhelming. And this is where I find one particular inkling extremely helpful. I have always drawn comfort in time of trouble from a very wise exchange that happens right at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings. Frodo has just had the life-changing news that the ring he inherited from Bilbo, which was thought of in the family as just a clever vanishing trick to hide from the less wanted relatives, the Sackville Bagginses. In fact, that funny, seemingly innocent artifact is in fact altogether evil and extremely dangerous. Now, Bilbo's unfortunate problem is that this ring has been hidden for thousands of years and only now come to light. And he is the one who is left literally holding it. And this is what he says. "I wish it need not have happened in my time," said Frodo. "So do I," said Gandalf, "and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us." So now, thinking personally, thinking for our communities, for our nations and globally, I'd like you to discuss together, what time is it for us all? What should we be doing now? How can we rise to that challenge that Gandalf mentioned? And also, we may feel like we're living through a new turning point of history. Like you've probably seen on the news, people are talking about it as one of those inflection moments in history. How do we cope with this? So please discuss that for 5 minutes. So we're aware these are very big questions, but they are the important questions too. And I thought, I don't know how far you got in your discussions, but I've got some very wise words said by our experts on this question you've just been discussing. And once we've watched that, Paul is going to come and give us yet more wise words to round us off for the evening. So take it away, experts.
Yeah, I think this is where Tolkien and Lewis are immensely helpful. I mean, think about Lewis's amazing talk that he gave, Learning in Wartime, to this packed church. It's just a few weeks, I think, after the Second World War has begun. Germany has invaded Poland, and virtually everyone in Great Britain believes there's going to be an invasion any moment now, because it's just the English Channel and Winston Churchill that separate Great Britain from catastrophe. And so what does he say in that amazing talk? We need to get on with our callings, even in the midst of the crisis. And to say that to young people who are wondering, how can anything we do matter right now at this moment when civilization itself maybe is hanging by a thread? And he just challenges them. Here you are in the moment. Here you are as scholars. This is your task. Do not let fear and the distractions of the day, the news of the war, get in the way of your work, because good work is done by the man. I'm paraphrasing now, the man or the woman who in some ways takes his tasks kind of lightly, takes the burden lightly, and receives the grace and the goodness that he or she can in the moment, in the day. Get on with your callings, even in the midst of the crisis. It's an amazing talk.
I think we discovered in the immediate crisis of the pandemic how rapidly we could change our habits, how completely we could reconfigure things, how even a government who was committed to sort of not spending and not taxing could suddenly provide furlough, how all that could be done. And the naysayers about changing the way we live for climate change said, oh, we'll never get around to it. But we perceived the threat and we changed for this. So I hope that's a catalyst for other changes that need to be made in relation to climate change, for other adaptations. So I hope, actually, we're living at a turning point in that sense, that we're going to take the prospect of climate change with the same radical seriousness with which we took the danger of the pandemic, and possibly even employ some of the same stratagems. I think that would be very helpful.
I don't know that we are living in a time that's so different. It feels new to us. I had worked last year with a group of students who were looking at C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity specifically. And their question, as they were doing their various research projects, was, is there anything in C.S. Lewis that's relevant now? I mean, he wrote this a long time ago. For us as Americans, he wrote this in a place far away. Is there anything that's relevant about what Lewis had to say in these radio broadcasts that have been collected in Mere Christianity? And my students were astonished the deeper they looked into it, not just at what they perceived to be eternal truths that Lewis expresses in that book, in those talks, but with how similar the struggles of Britain during wartime are to the experiences my students were having during pandemic in Southern California. And the sense of isolation, living daily with fear and uncertainty, the surprising difficulty, the surprising difficulty of getting clear information and knowing kind of how to think and process information. These were things that they noticed that seemed to be perpetual. And the experience of working with them helped me to clarify my own sense that we go through seasons that feel unique, but there's so many ways in which these are repeats or retellings of experiences that are just part of the human condition.
Well, for Aristotle, I think it was simply a way of thinking about change. For Newton, it had an absolute existence, flowing, sort of untouched and untouchable. Einstein realized that it very much could be touched, it could be stretched and twisted, it could be pressed upon. We're thinking, of course, about time. I love this quote from Augustine, if we could have it, Peter. It says, "What is time then? If no one asks me, I know. But if I were desirous to explain it to the one that should ask me, plainly I do not know." You know, time, one of those things, we all sort of know what it is until someone says, "What is it?" Why did God create us to live in time? I think one reason possibly is because he created us to be creatures who enjoy and experience the process of transformation and the process of growth into the fullness of God's image as God presents himself to us and as we respond to him in successive moments of the present. I think the present is well thought of as a gift from God in which we are invited to encounter him through his word and his spirit. The present is always contextualized by our past, and in turn, of course, it shapes our future, because the present is an encounter that comes to us with the intention of continuing the course of God's transforming work in us until it is fully complete in eternity. As Simon said, I think Lewis reflects this view of time in his book, The Great Divorce. One writer put it like this: Lewis's The Great Divorce promotes a theology of the present as the moment when God meets man. And here I think Lewis reflects a very significant aspect of the Bible's view of time. So here is the writer of Hebrews, Hebrews chapter 3. The writer of Hebrews says this: "So as the Holy Spirit says, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. But encourage one another daily, as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness." You see the point. Today is the day of encounter. Today is the day of transformation. And in many ways, as Simon said, Lewis's The Great Divorce is a dramatization of this truth. Again, the quote, again, if we could go full screen. One writer says, "The solid people reiterate the urgency of the present to the ghosts in almost every conversation as they repeatedly announce that the time for spiritual transformation is the now." This understanding of the present, I think, is profoundly good news, because it means that there is no moment in time that has to be hopeless. Because every present moment always holds out the offer of a divine encounter and a positive transformation. Because God always offers himself fully in the present moment. And therefore his transformative work can't be hijacked by my mistakes in the past, nor by my fears of the future, because God didn't create us to live frozen in the past or floating free in some imagined future, but rather to meet him in the present and to enjoy and be shaped by him in this encounter now, contextualized by past and future. Doesn't mean that we forget the past or ignore the future, because the whole point, of course, is that God is growing our whole integrated life through time. But since God knows our past better than we do, and since he knows our future much, much better than we do, and indeed since, as Simon and Julia pointed out, our past and our future are always present to God, then we can trust that God's encounter with us in the present will always take those realities into account. That his present ministry to us and his call on us today will incorporate our past and will anticipate our future in a way that is good for us and resounds to his glory. God always presents himself to us in the present, and that is why the devil tries to make us live in the past and or in the future. And Lewis has that wonderful section from, I think it's letter 15 of the Screwtape Letters, and Simon read a little bit. Let me read a little bit too, and again I think the quote will come up on the screen. He, God, would therefore have them, so this is Screwtape the devil talking, continually concerned either with eternity, which means being concerned with him, or with the present, either meditating on their eternal union with himself, or else obeying the present voice of conscience, bearing the present cross, receiving present grace, giving thanks for the present pleasure. So, the devil says, our business is to get them away from the eternal and from the present. With this in view, we sometimes tempt a human to live in the past. But this is of limited value, for they have some real knowledge of the past, and it has a determinate nature, and to that extent at least resembles eternity. Far better to make them live in the future. Biological necessity makes all their passions point in that direction already, so that thought about the future inflames hope and fear. Also, it is unknown to them, so that in making them think about it, we are making them think of unrealities. Isn't that interesting? We're making them play the what-if game. So the devil wants us to be shackled by regrets in our past or to play the what-ifs of an imagined future, whereas God wants us to be fully present to him and fully attentive to him in the present, alive to his transforming work and the possibilities that attend it in the present. The past doesn't have the power to undermine the purposes of God in the present. We don't forget the past as if that were possible. Rather, we are alive to the ways God might use it positively in his ongoing construction of us in the present, as he uses our past to perhaps grow present gratitude for grace, or particular sensitivity to sin, or an ability to minister to others who are walking a road that we once walked, or whatever it might be. In this way, God weaves our past in ways that feed into his ongoing, moment-by-moment transformation of us. And neither, of course, are we to live in the future, at least not the one that we often construct, obsessed with imagined what-ifs. We see that, of course, in what Jesus says to his disciples when he says, do not worry about tomorrow. Don't live in tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Now again, Jesus isn't saying you should ignore the future, you should make no plans about the future, make no decisions. The Bible calls us to make some plans and decisions and be prepared as far as we can for the future. We're not supposed to live as if we lived in some temporal vacuum, but rather he's saying don't live in the future, right? Prepare for it, but don't live in it. Don't project yourselves into it and anticipate a scenario that ignores the promise of God to always be present, sufficient, and faithful in every present moment, including the ones yet to come. Don't live in the future, Jesus says, rather first seek his kingdom and his righteousness today. Encounter him today. Let your life in the present be shaped by the righteousness that God is growing in us and the kingdom he is growing in us and through us. And of course, as you do that, as you live like that in the day, so you are forming the future. And you are being formed by him for the future that he already well knows. That is to let God's future, that is to let God's eternal future for us shape our present plans and decision-making rightly. So we magnify the present, but of course we don't make it everything. We don't fill each unforgiving minute with as much as we can because, of course, the present, as Lewis points out in Screwtape, is not ultimate. The now is not to be shaped by the false belief that the now is all there is, and therefore crammed full with as much distraction as we can manage. Rather, the present is to be viewed as the next step on the path that God is walking with us towards the eternity that he has prepared for us and is, moment by moment, preparing us for. That will bring, I think, a godly, God-shaped dynamic to our present. The eternity God has prepared for us and is preparing us for shapes God's encounter with us moment by moment and our moment by moment seeking of his kingdom and his righteousness. And may God give us the grace so to do. Amen. Friends, that draws our evening to a close this evening, and a reminder then that our final Lent with the Inklings evening is at the same time next Wednesday evening, and I hope you can join us as we think about the Inklings and their understanding of story for us.